Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. My name is Eugene Rule, and I'm a member of the Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Marxist Library. And while you're getting settled, let me tell you a little bit about the background of our library and our institute. We all live in cyberspace right now, but our physical home is 6501 Telegraph Avenue in Oakland, about a mile south of the UC Berkeley campus. Our library is built around a collection of books and manuscripts from two remarkable individuals, Carl Niebel, who is a Marxist economist who fled Nazi Germany in the 30s and made a new home in California, and also Roscoe Proctor, a farm worker, longshoreman, and member of the Communist Party's political committee. And since our founding, the library has served not only as a research library, but also as a community center, providing affordable meeting space for community groups involved in our common struggle for racial and gender equality and for socialism. The Institute was formed about 20 years ago at the, in order to further the library's goals for racial and gender equality and for socialism. Some of us are members of specific parties and tendencies, others are not. So our workshops, forums, and publications do not follow any party line, nor do they represent any kind of group consensus on the issues involved. We are united, however, in our respect for the work of Karl Marx and our belief that his work will remain as important for the future class struggles of the future as they have been in the past. And I came across a nice quote from Marx to segue into today's program. It's from his letter to Arnold Ruge in 1843. He said, "But if the designing of the future and proclamation of ready-made solutions for all time is not our affair, then we realize all the more clearly what we have to accomplish in the present. I am speaking of a ruthless criticism of the existing order, ruthless in two senses. The criticism must not be afraid of its own conclusions, nor of conflict with the powers that be." And I think of our speaker today, Grover Furr, who carries out this very important task of dealing in the forefront of the controversy, many of the major controversies that are facing our movement today. So to tell you more about Grover, let me turn it over to Raj, I believe, right?
Yes, it's fine.
Okay.
Thank you, Gene. It's really an honor for me to introduce Professor Grover.
Raj, we can't hear you.
Hello?
Raj?
Raj, we can't hear you.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Bad signal.
I don't know. I think the connection is a problem.
Okay, go ahead.
Unstable connection. It says unstable connection.
Can you maybe, if you...
Yeah, can I go ahead?
Go ahead.
Okay, so can you, if you hear me, it's my honor. It's a very great honor for me to introduce Professor Furr, who is well known to many of you and around the world. He teaches medieval English literature at Montclair State University in New Jersey, but is best known for his work on the Stalin era history of the USSR, that is 1923 to 53. In 2011, he published his book titled Khrushchev Lied. Until then, the dominant narrative in the academic circles and mass media in the US, Western Europe in general, but also in Russia, was that Stalin had committed many crimes that Khrushchev accused him of in his dramatic speech in 1956, 3 years following Stalin's death. But Grover's first meticulous research using the declassified, recently released archival material in Russia with the help of his partner, Vladimir Bobrov. Since the fall of the USSR, there has been material available. Both of them have showed that none of Khrushchev's 63 charges that he investigated were true. This is documented in his book, Khrushchev Life. Rather than accept or contest his findings, the bourgeois scholar shunned him. His further research has led to publications of the following books. In 2013, The Murder of Sergei Kirov. 2014, Blood Lies. 2015, Trotsky's Amalgams. 2016, Yezhov versus Stalin. 2017, Leon Trotsky's collaboration with Germany and Japan. 2018, The Fraud of the Dewey Commission. Another book is The Moscow Trials as Evidence. And the third one in the same year, The Mystery of Katyn Massacre. In 2019, Stalin, Waiting for the Truth. And by the way, in our videos, he has had nearly 6,000 viewings of his talk here at in our viewing of any programs in our what we present. And now he's written a book titled Trotsky's Lies. Trotsky's Lies was also written in 2019, and his latest is New Evidence of Trotsky's Conspiracy. That's 2020. His topic for today's talk is Trotsky was a collaborator and terrorist, and what this means for us today. He'll speak for about 40 minutes. Then following a brief intermission, he will answer questions and respond to comments, as is our usual format for our Sunday sessions. We will continue till 1 p.m. our time, the last half an hour being informal discussion. Please join me in welcoming Professor Furr, Professor and Historian Grover Furr. Go ahead, Grover.
Mehmet, you're going to have to take over. I can't seem to be able to unmute people.
Okay, just a minute, Grover. There you go. I asked to unmute. Yes.
Okay, now can you hear
Much
me?
better. Yes.
Right,
Yes.
yeah,
Much
no,
better.
I was muted before. Okay, the audio just about right, because I'm going to read this talk, and it'd be better not to stop in the middle, you know. Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you for your generous introduction, Raj, and of course, thank you, all of you, for and especially to Jean for inviting me to speak to you again. Sorry we can't do it in person, but this is a lot better than not doing it at all. So I'm going to read my talk. It should take about 36 minutes. And then we can have the question and answer. This talk will mainly focus on my latest book, New Evidence of Trotsky's Conspiracies. I don't know if you can see it, but that's what the cover looks like there. Okay, it's on Amazon, and you can take a look at it. New Evidence of Trotsky's Conspiracies. But first, I want to tell you how I came to be interested in researching the history of the Soviet Union during the years when Joseph Stalin was in the leadership of the USSR and of the international communist movement. When I was in college, the United States invaded South Vietnam and began a war, during which between 2 and 4 million Vietnamese, almost all of them civilians, were killed. It was a few years before I realized that this was a completely unjust imperialist war. As I stood on the sidewalk watching a large anti-war demonstration in Manhattan, someone behind me said that we should not oppose the American war in Vietnam. Why? Because the Vietnamese guerrillas were led by the Communist Party of Vietnam, which was led by Ho Chi Minh, who had been trained by Stalin, and, quote, Stalin killed 20 million people. This sounded serious, so I decided that someday I would look into it. After I got my teaching job and had some time, I commuted many times from New Jersey, where I live, to the New York Public Library, where I checked the footnotes in Robert Conquest's book, The Great Terror, Stalin's Purge of the 30s, a huge volume with more than 1,000 footnotes. Because I knew Russian, French, and German, I could check them. I discovered that Conquest never cited any evidence for the claims he made that Stalin had committed enormous crimes. All he did was quote other writers who also made these claims. That, of course, is not evidence. However, many people do not understand this. Eventually, I decided to do some research myself. I chose the Tukhachevsky affair, or military purge, of 1937, because there seemed to be more material about it. In the early 1980s, I wrote and rewrote many drafts of an article. In 1988, it was finally published in a mainstream Soviet history journal, Russian History. Though not without opposition and difficulty, an interesting story in itself that I won't go into now. In 1999, a Moscow researcher, Vladimir Lvovich Babarov, contacted me and proposed that the two of us do research on this topic. Vladimir informed me that many documents from former Soviet archives were gradually being published in Russia. While obtaining and studying these documents, I discovered that some of them contained evidence that contradicts what Nikita Khrushchev had stated in his famous secret speech to the 20th Party Congress of the CPSU in February 1956. So I dropped my other projects and concentrated on checking the accusations in Khrushchev's speech. I finally determined that not a single accusation that Khrushchev made in that famous speech against Stalin or Lavrentiy Beria is true. Moreover, I found that I could prove that Khrushchev had deliberately lied in at least 2/3 of the accusations he made. My book, Khrushchev Lied, was published in Russian in Moscow in December 2008 and in English in February 2011. I've spent 10 years since then collecting and studying primary source evidence, largely from former Soviet archives, and in researching and writing many articles and 10 or 12 books, depending on how you count them. In every case, my goal has been to investigate some accusation against Stalin, some alleged crime or other, by looking for the evidence. And to date, in every single case, I have discovered that there is no evidence that Stalin committed even one of the crimes of which he has been accused. My latest book, published in May 2020, is entitled New Evidence of Trotsky's Conspiracy. That's the one. There it is, okay? This book is a study of recently declassified Soviet-era documents about Leon Trotsky and his conspiracies against the Soviet government and party during the 1930s. The results of this study include the following. These documents provide yet more strong evidence that Leon Trotsky did indeed conspire with both Nazi Germany and Fascist Japan against the Soviet Union. The documents relate to the first and second Moscow trials of August 1936 and January 1937. Today, we have a great deal of evidence that, in all of the three famous Moscow trials of 1936 through 1938, the NKVD, that's the political police, did not force those under interrogation to confess. The evidence shows that the defendants were guilty of at least those crimes to which they confessed. These documents provide evidence that the Trotskyists and Trotsky himself were indirectly involved in the assassination of Sergei Kirov. On December 1st, 1934, Kirov was the party leader in Leningrad. They were also planning similar assassinations. We have more details about the ties between the German secret police, the Gestapo, and the Trotskyist conspiracy. Trotsky had made it clear to his followers that he was instructing them to collaborate with all of those, including Nazis and fascists, who opposed the Stalin government. Valentin Olberg, an important defendant at the first Moscow trial of August 1936, was indeed guilty of collaborating with Trotsky and the Gestapo. Trotsky also collaborated with Great Britain and France through Grigory Sokolnikov, and with Japan through Christian Rakovsky. Yuri Pyatakov did indeed meet with Trotsky in Norway in December 1935. Chapters 1 through 3 examine a collection of documents that have important implications for the study of Leon Trotsky's activities during the decade of the 1930s. For our understanding of the Moscow trials of 1936 through 38, and for the history of the Soviet Union during the period of Joseph Stalin's leadership. Politburo y Lev Trotsky, that's the title, it means Politburo and Leon Trotsky, is a 2-volume collection of documents from former Soviet archives. Almost all are published and thus made available to researchers for the first time. These volumes were published in 2013 in a very small printing, and not in Russia, but in the Czech Republic. They are from the Central Archive of the FSB, which is the Russian successor to the NKVD, as the commissariat or ministry was called during most of the period in question. These volumes are virtually impossible to obtain. As recently as yesterday, that is December 12th, 2020, I checked the OCLC Worldwide Meta-Catalog of Academic Libraries. The listing for this work reads, quote, "Sorry, no libraries with a specific item were found." There is a 1-volume version published in Russia in 2017, but it omits some of the most interesting documents that are in the 2-volume Czech edition. My wonderful Moscow colleague, Vladimir Barbarov, gained access to the author's copy for some hours and photographed every page for me. There are no grounds to doubt that these documents are genuine. Their editor, Oleg B. Mozokhin, is the chief researcher for the FSB. He has published a number of important collections and studies of documents from the former NKVD, including important studies of the repression and violence perpetrated during the 1930s by this agency of the Soviet government. The significance of these documents is as follows. They constitute yet more important evidence that the pretrial interrogations in the 1936 and 1937 Moscow trials were not fabricated in any way by the NKVD, were not forced upon the defendants. And instead, all the evidence we now have supports the hypothesis that these trials were genuine, in that the prosecution believed the charges they brought against the defendants, while the defendants testified as they chose to testify. They are confirmed by evidence from outside the Soviet Union, particularly evidence from Trotsky's own papers in the Harvard Trotsky Archive. A good friend of mine used the term triangulate to describe the way in which I use multiple sources to verify statements with the aid of the documents in these volumes. Here are a couple of examples to illustrate how I do this. First example, on page 45, I write, quote, "In a report to Stalin dated January 20, 1933, OGPU Chief Genrikh Yagoda," the OGPU was the name of the police group changed in 1934 to NKVD. OGPU Chief Genrikh Yagoda reported that a new letter from Trotsky had been received by Ivan Smirnov's group in mid-October. Smirnov was the head of the Russian, the Soviet branch of Trotsky's underground movement. And we know that also from the Trotsky archive. Trotsky wrote about that. In it, unexpectedly for Yagoda, Trotsky said, quote, "The slogan, 'Remove Stalin,' is not our slogan. Down with the personal regime, that is not right," end quote. This statement in Yagoda's report agrees completely with documents found in the Harvard Trotsky Archive in the early 80s by Trotsky's historian Pierre Brouet, documents that I have published and discussed in my book, Trotsky's Amalgams. Brouet outlines the discussion between Trotsky and his son Leon Sedov concerning use of this slogan. Trotsky in October 1932 told Sedov that they should not adopt it as yet in order not to alienate other potential allies. This shows that Yagoda did not falsify the information he received in order to falsely frame Trotsky. On the contrary, Yagoda accurately reported that in 1932, Trotsky did not support the slogan, "Remove Stalin." A second example of this method of triangulation of sources again using documents in the Harvard Trotsky archive to verify a Soviet NKVD document, concerns the Trotskyist conspirator Yuri Gavin. We find yet more striking confirmation of the truthfulness of the interrogations contained in this volume in an interrogation of clandestine Trotskyist Alexander Ilyich Birkengoff of May 23 through 25, 1936. Birkengoff testified that he had been in direct touch with Yuri Gavin, who had himself met with Trotsky personally. Trotsky was in exile abroad. Birkengoff testified that in December 1932, quote, Gavin informed me that he had established contact with I.N. Smirnov, leader of the Trotskyist organization in the Soviet Union, that the situation in the organization was tense since Smirnov had reason to believe that the arrests were imminent, and Gavin specifically told me that Smirnov himself expected to be arrested, end quote. This corresponds exactly to what Sedov reported about Smirnov and his group to Trotsky in his block letter that Brouet discovered in the Harvard Trotsky archive and published in his own journal, Cahiers Léon Trotsky, issue number 5, 1980. The documents in Politburo y Lev Trotsky confirm and are confirmed by other evidence from former Soviet archives. They also contain many important nuggets of testimony. For example, this one by Vladimir Mikhailovich Andreev, a former Tsarist officer and member of a Russian fascist organization that was working with the Trotskyists. In September 1936, the local leader of his fascist organization, a certain Peshikhonov, told him that they were working for Germany, but that they had to cut back their activity because of the arrests of 3 people. Andreev was confused and testified as follows, quote, I was very surprised since hearing the names, I recognized them as members of the party, the Communist Party. I said to Peshikhonov, they are communists, aren't they? Peshikhonov answered me, quote, they are not communists, but Trotskyists. And communists and Trotskyists are as different from one another as day from night. Then Peshikhonov told me that the Trotskyists played an especially active role in our organization. In their hostility and vengeance against the party, they would stop at nothing, end quote. In chapter 2 of my book, I examined the evidence in these documents of Trotsky's work with the Nazis, fascists, and Ukrainian nationalists. Chapter 3 discusses the evidence of Trotsky's plan for defeatism, terrorism, assassination, and collaboration. Chapter 4 analyzes Yuri Protokov's statement to Nikolai Yezhov, the chairman of the NKVD, of December 19th through 20th, 1936. In it, Pyatakov offers an account of the Trotskyist conspiracy, including important facts about Trotsky's personal leadership that has not been available before. As I demonstrate, it simply cannot have been scripted by the NKVD or prosecution. It represents what Pyatakov chose to say. It confirms Pyatakov's and Radek's account in their testimony at the Second Moscow trial of January 1937. It confirms that Pyatakov did indeed make a secret trip to Trotsky in Norway in December 1935. It confirms Trotsky's collaboration with both Germany and Japan. Chapter 5 of my book discusses the details of Trotsky's collaboration in the so-called Tukhachevsky affair with high-ranking military conspirators and the Germans, as reflected in the text of the transcript of the trial of the military conspirators of June 11th, 1937. This trial transcript, which we have been requesting for years, was quietly declassified in May 2018. Within the next few weeks, hopefully before January 1st, I, together with my Russian colleague Vladimir Bobrov and my Swedish colleague Sven-Erik Holmström, will publish an English translation of the full text of this trial transcript, together with 14 chapters of corroborating evidence, both Soviet and non-Soviet. I hope you will invite me to speak to you about this book during the spring or summer of 2021. Okay, here's a quotation from Engels. Quote, the bourgeoisie turns everything into a commodity, hence also the writing of history. It is part of its being, of its condition for existence. To falsify all goods, it falsifies the writing of history. And the best paid historiography is that which is best falsified for the purpose of the bourgeoisie. That's Friedrich Engels, Notes for the History of Ireland, 1870. According to the standard model of Soviet history, I call it the anti-Stalin paradigm, Stalin was guilty of many horrific crimes. In mainstream historiography, it is considered illegitimate even to question, much less disprove, any charge of a serious crime against Stalin. Researchers of Soviet history of the Stalin period are constrained to adhere to the anti-Stalin paradigm, regardless of the evidence. The anti-Stalin paradigm, therefore, is not a way of learning what really happened. Rather, it is a way of not learning what really happened. It is a way of telling historians, quote, your task is to reach acceptable anti-Stalin, anti-communist conclusions, and, where necessary, to back those conclusions up with phony evidence and fallacious reasoning, end quote. Or at best, quote, your job is to limit yourself to drawing conclusions that do not challenge or threaten to disprove the anti-Stalin paradigm. A similar paradigm controls Trotskyist writings, which must conclude that Trotsky was honest and correct, and Stalin was dishonest and wrong, even when all the evidence points to the opposite conclusion. Today, we have a great deal of evidence that corroborates the charges leveled against Trotsky in the Moscow trials of conspiring to murder Soviet leaders, sabotage Soviet industry, undermine the Soviet military, and collude with Nazi Germany and Fascist Japan for the defeat of the Soviet Union in war. However, Trotskyist historians cannot deal objectively with this evidence, or they will no longer be welcome in the ranks of Trotskyism. Likewise, no academic historian of the Soviet Union can conclude that Stalin was not guilty of this or that crime of which he has been accused, or they will not be published, and their academic careers will be ruined. It is always appropriate, and in fact essential, to discuss questions of evidence. However, the role of bias, anti-communist and specifically anti-Stalin bias, poisons the entire field of Soviet history. Denial and evasion of evidence is so pervasive that I must say something about it here. The academic field of Soviet history of the Stalin period exists primarily to promote falsehoods. The truth about Stalin and the history of the Soviet Union during Stalin's time, and about Trotsky and his conspiracies, is simply too threatening to be honestly confronted. The evidence supporting these conclusions is too strong, and there is too much of it for it to be mentioned, much less discussed. The only way to, quote, save the anti-Stalin and Trotskyist paradigms of Soviet history is to ignore the evidence and to continue to repeat accusations that we can now prove false. It would be excellent if some mainstream historians of Soviet history would subject the evidence in my books and articles to scholarly critique. I would welcome such criticism. However, I do not expect this to happen. Willful ignorance and personal attacks on me for daring to contradict the prevailing falsehoods about Stalin and Soviet history of this period have been the only response to my research. My goal is to discover the truth. I do not defend or apologize for Stalin. If Stalin committed crimes, I want to know what they were. However, persons who perpetuate falsehoods in the service of a political agenda assume that everyone else is doing the same thing. Dishonest persons justify their own dishonesty by assuming that everyone else is also dishonest. That is why they call me a defender of or apologist for Stalin. Let me say a few words about logical fallacies. Alan Wald, a prominent American Trotskyist, has called me a conspiracy theorist. Readers should recognize this as a logical fallacy. The argumentum ad hominem, that is the ad hominem argument, an attack on the person making an argument rather than on the argument and evidence itself. Wikipedia has a useful definition of conspiracy theory, and here it is. Quote, conspiracy theories resist falsification and are reinforced by circular reasoning. Both evidence against the conspiracy and an absence of evidence for it are reinterpreted as evidence of its truth, and the conspiracy becomes a matter of faith rather than proof, end quote. Now, Leon Trotsky claimed that Stalin was conspiring, plotting, to wipe out personal enemies and any potential threat to his own power. There was not then, nor is there now, any evidence at all to support Trotsky's notion that Stalin was conspiring to do away with personal rivals and enemies. Therefore, according to this definition, Wikipedia's definition, Leon Trotsky himself was a conspiracy theorist. Trotskyists and Cold War anti-communists may claim that the Soviet, Stalin's, accusations against the oppositionists in the Soviet Union also constitute a conspiracy theory. That's what Alan Wald is essentially claiming. However, we know now that this is not the case. The Soviet investigators and prosecution did not base their conclusions on prejudice or insufficient evidence. They had a great deal of evidence. More such evidence continues to be made public. We also have significant non-Soviet evidence that could not possibly have been coerced or planted by the Soviets. Alan Wald adheres to the Trotsky cult. He believes Trotsky. This makes Wald himself a conspiracy theorist in that, in defiance of all the evidence, he continues to uncritically believe Trotsky's charges against Stalin. It is a dishonest, though clever, rhetorical ploy to call someone you disagree with a conspiracy theorist, when in reality, the term applies to you yourself. The late Stephen Cohen, a senior scholar of the Stalin period and defender of the anti-Stalin paradigm, has called me, quote, a Stalin terror denier or apologist, end quote, and, quote, a pseudo-scholar who disregards or falsifies overwhelming evidence, end quote. However, Cohen was blowing smoke. Neither he nor any scholar of Soviet history of the Stalin period has any evidence that Stalin planned the so-called terror. On the contrary, all the evidence supports the opposite conclusion. Cohen simply asserts that there is evidence that I am disregarding or falsifying, but he cites no examples. He cannot do so because no such evidence exists. When Cohen wrote that, this is in a different place, quote, Furr has no standing among serious scholars, he was committing the logical fallacy of appeal to authority. The fact that others disagree with me is not evidence that I am wrong, any more than the fact that I do not agree with them is evidence that they are wrong. Only primary source evidence counts, not the authority of scholars or anybody else. The problems of logical fallacies and preconceived bias persist even among Marxists. Here is an example of fallacious thinking by the editors of Science and Society, a scholarly Marxist journal of worldwide reputation for 80 years. The Science and Society editors correctly stated, quote, Furr argues that almost all of these claims of crimes by Stalin, from the Khrushchev revelations to the mountains of established scholarly works on the subject, are false, end quote. Then they state, quote, we must be clear. We need to be clear. The great majority of the Science and Society editorial board and manuscript collective do not accept Furr's position, end quote. This is an example of the fallacy of personal incredulity. That's a logical fallacy. On what basis do the editors say this? Not from studying the evidence, let alone studying it in a strictly objective manner. They just don't accept it. That is to say, they don't believe it. In reality, the Science and Society editors have no basis either to agree or to disagree with me. The great majority of the board is basing their non-acceptance of my position, by which they mean the results of my research, on bias and preconceived notions, no doubt bolstered by the authority of some unidentified person or persons. So, how can we learn the truth? How can we avoid being blinded by our own biases and preconceived ideas? It is a basic tenet of materialism that one's conclusions about reality, including historical reality, must be firmly based on evidence. This is the only way to discover the truth, whether in science or in history. The primary source evidence must be identified, located, collected, studied, and conclusions drawn from it that are based on the evidence alone, not on preconceived ideas, biases, or prejudices, without faults in logic or reasoning. The materialist researcher must work hard to be thoroughly objective. She must be aware and suspicious of her own biases and preconceived ideas. Everyone possesses biases, prejudices, and preconceived ideas. Therefore, the materialist researcher must adopt a method that is closely similar to that used in the hard sciences, like physics or chemistry. She must be self-aware. It is her own preconceived ideas and biases, not those of anyone else, which are most likely to mislead her and to poison her research. She must take special pains to look with increased suspicion at any evidence or argument that tends to confirm her own preconceived ideas. This is the threat of confirmation bias. Here is Wikipedia's definition. Quote, confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that affirms one's prior beliefs or hypotheses, end quote. She must also force herself to look with an additional dose of sympathy and interest at any evidence or argument that tends to disconfirm her own preconceived ideas. This is the only way to put into practice, to operationalize the ideal of objectivity. If a researcher fails to be objective, she will never discover the truth. Indeed, she will not even recognize it if, by chance, she should stumble across it. Only primary source evidence is acceptable evidence. Secondary sources are studies by scholars who themselves use primary source evidence. These are not evidence, though they can be very useful for other purposes. For example, in identifying primary source evidence and in providing interpretations of primary source evidence that can inform one's own interpretation of them. No primary source evidence is proof positive or a smoking gun. In historical study, human beings who have biases, prejudices, and memories that change over time create all primary sources. All primary source evidence must be carefully examined in the context of other primary source evidence. When we find statements or fact claims made by different persons at different times in different places that agree with each other, it becomes more and more likely that the statements are either true or reflect what the persons making the statements believed to be true. On December 20th, 2019, Russian President Vladimir Putin gave a talk in which he refuted the often repeated falsehood that the Soviet Union shared with Hitler's Germany the responsibility for starting World War II. Putin cited more than 30 primary source documents. Specialists have long known all of them. These documents show that it was Poland and the Western imperialist countries that made the war inevitable by catering to Hitler and by rejecting all the Soviet Union's attempts to build collective security against Hitler. Responses from Polish and Western sources were quick in coming. None of these responses even mentioned, let alone confronted, the primary source evidence that Putin cited. In The Atlantic, anti-communist commentator Anne Applebaum called it Putin's big lie. But what Putin said is not a lie. It is the truth. The reason is clear. The documents do indeed prove the guilt of the governments of Poland, the UK, France, and even the United States in mollifying Hitler and refusing collective security. Instead of dealing forthrightly with the evidence, the Polish and Western responses called his remarks, quote, Stalinist propaganda, end quote. This is true in the sense that Putin's remarks echoed the position of the Soviet government of the late 1930s and the post-war period. However, in the dishonest world of anti-communist propaganda, to term a statement Stalinist means that it does not have to be refuted. Any statement called Stalinist is assumed to be false, even when it's true. Any intelligent person who reads the text of Putin's remarks would notice this trick. However, few people will do so. Many more will read the dishonest attacks by the Polish government and anti-communist writers. The mass media do not deal with research. They must publish too quickly. Writers for the mass media rely upon legitimated authorities such as academic experts. Writers of popular and semi-popular works and authors of textbooks for use in schools and colleges also rely on academic historians. The media and the public assume, falsely assume, that academic authorities base what they write and say upon evidence. However, in the field of Soviet studies of the Stalin period, this assumption is not valid. Certain fundamental falsehoods about Soviet history of this period cannot be questioned, regardless of the evidence. Evidence that contradicts this taboo is ignored, while false evidence is invented. This is how the anti-Stalin paradigm works. The conclusions to be drawn from the primary source evidence are as firmly established as they are unacceptable. unacceptable to mainstream anti-communist scholarship and to Trotskyists, and thereby unacceptable in public discourse. Some of the main conclusions are such as the following. Collectivization of agriculture was entirely beneficial. It stopped the 1,000-year cycle of devastating famines every 3 or 4 years and permitted Soviet agriculture to be mechanized. The defendants in the 3 Moscow trials of August 1936, January 1937, and March 1938 were provably guilty of at least those crimes to which they admitted guilt. The Tukhachevsky affair commanders, arrested in May 1937, tried and executed in June 1937, did indeed conspire to join forces with Nazi Germany to seize control over the Soviet Union. NKVD chairman Nikolai Yezhov, not Stalin, masterminded the mass murders of Soviet citizens in 1937-38. This is the phenomenon often called the Great Terror. He did so behind the backs of Stalin and the Soviet government. Once Lavrentiy Beria replaced him, Yezhov and his men were found out, arrested, and put on trial. Many of them, Yezhov included, were executed. Leon Trotsky was indeed provably guilty of plotting to murder Sergei Kirov, Stalin, and other Soviet leaders, of conspiring with the German general staff and the Nazi leadership to overthrow the Soviet government and party leadership, either by a coup d'etat or by aiding a German and/or Japanese invasion, and of conspiring with German agents, Russian fascists, Ukrainian nationalists, plus his own followers, to sabotage economic enterprises in the Soviet Union in order to weaken Soviet defense. These are the same charges that were leveled by the Stalin government against Trotsky during the 1930s. They are the same as those that were summarized very well in the famous book by Michael Sayers and Albert E. Kahn, The Great Conspiracy, The Secret War Against Soviet Russia, first published in 1946, translated into dozens of languages, and republished until Khrushchev's secret speech. We need to follow the logic of these facts, now well established through primary source evidence, in order to draw out their implications. If Leon Trotsky and his allies, the fascist powers, had overthrown the Soviet leadership and seized control of the Soviet Union, 1. Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese fascist militarists, the Axis powers, would have been immeasurably stronger. They would have had the immense natural and human resources of the Soviet Union to use in their wars against the Western imperialist powers, especially the UK, France, and the United States. 2. The Western imperialist powers might well have chosen to compromise with Hitler and the Japanese, rather than risk an all-out war against a very much stronger fascist enemy. After all, Britain and France were far more eager to go to war against the Soviet Union in 1940 in alliance with pro-German Finland than they were to send their armies against Hitler. Either scenario would have left fascism secure and in control of a great part of the world. Much, if not most of the world would resemble Vichy France or Francisco Franco's Spain, a murderous, viciously exploitative police state maintained by fascist terror against everyone who opposed its aims. The anti-racist and anti-imperialist struggles for national liberation from imperialism would have been dealt a tremendous blow. The consequences for the fates of hundreds of millions of the non-white people in the world can hardly be overestimated. Hitler's stated goal in General Plan East was to murder most of the Slavic peoples, tens of millions, and keep the rest for cheap labor. The Nazis and their fascist allies like the Vichy French and Ukrainian nationalists killed almost half the world's Jews. Had Hitler prevailed, that number would have been 90% or even more. All around the world, the labor movement would have suffered much more intense repression. In a world, much of which was directly ruled by fascists, while the rulers of the rest of the world temporized and collaborated with the fascists, the standard of living of working people would have fallen drastically, while their mortality would have skyrocketed. Human progress would have suffered an enormous setback in every area of life. A great many persons alive today would never have been born at all. Most other people would be suffering far more exploitation and oppression. The Soviet Union was able to defeat the fascist invasion because the chain of conspiracies, with Trotsky at the center and the fascists providing the military might, while the Western imperialists facilitated both, was smashed by the Stalin regime. The Soviet Union saved the world from fascism not just once by defeating the Nazi juggernaut in battle, but twice. The first time by smashing the Trotskyist, Nazi, fascist, capitalist conspiracies to turn the Soviet Union into Hitler's ally. Understanding of this fact was widespread after World War II, when the Great Conspiracy became a worldwide bestseller. The forces that overthrew this understanding of history did not come from anti-communist historians, but from within. Nikita Khrushchev's infamous secret speech to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1956 began the process of denying the truth about the anti-Soviet conspiracies and Trotsky's role in them. Khrushchev accelerated his attack on the truth at the 22nd Party Congress in 1961. The lies of Khrushchev and his historical propagandists were avidly taken up by anti-communist historians around the world. Millions of communists, workers, students, and other anti-capitalist forces, and potentially pro-communist activists, also believed Khrushchev. They would never have believed any overtly capitalist propaganda, no matter how scholarly it appeared. But they accepted the word of Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Communist Party and the world communist movement. Inspired by Khrushchev's slander of Stalin, anti-communist propagandists got to work. But their lies would never have been so widely accepted if Khrushchev had not loosed an army of phony historians to add details to his attack on Stalin. Within a few years, Khrushchev's propagandists had accused Stalin of dozens of crimes and atrocities. None of these accusations, none of them, was supported by primary source evidence. Though he never admitted it, Khrushchev copied some of his flagrant lies about Stalin from Trotsky's writing. Anti-communist writers chose to believe Trotsky's lies, just as they chose to believe the lies of the Khrushchevites. In 1956, Trotskyism was a tiny movement with little influence. Khrushchev's secret speech and subsequent avalanche of lies about Stalin changed that. To some people, Trotsky now appeared to be the prophet that Trotsky admirer Isaac Deutscher had called him. Anti-communist writers now believed Trotsky's version of events, just as they believed the lies of Khrushchev and his men. For anti-communists and Trotskyists, this torrent of filth that the so-called communist leaders were pouring over their own heritage was too good not to make full use of. As a result of Khrushchev's lies, many people started to consider Trotsky a lone, courageous voice for true communism against the monster Stalin. This remains the historical orthodoxy to this day. Trotskyists constructed a cult of personality around their hero. For them, Trotsky's writings became the source of all political wisdom. Trotskyist groups soared in membership as they claimed to be the good communists, but they paid a price. Trotskyism became parasitical on overtly anti-communist scholarship. Today, with the flood of primary source documents coming out of former Soviet archives, we have the evidence to prove that Trotsky lied flagrantly and frequently. As this and my previous books have demonstrated, we also have the evidence to prove that Trotsky was an arch criminal who was leading serious conspiracies of sabotage, assassination, and fascist collaboration. Today, the Trotskyist movement is wedded to the professional anti-communist scholars more firmly than ever. Trotskyism functions as a Trojan horse, a phony left wing that really serves conventional pro-capitalist anti-communism. There was never any evidence to support Trotsky's claims, which we can now prove were all intentional lies. However, regardless of the evidence, Trotskyists, or at least the leadership of the Trotskyist groups, are never going to admit the truth. In this too, they resemble the professional anti-communist so-called scholars. So, anti-communists and Trotskyists will reject the research in this book of mine and in all my books and articles because they cannot honestly confront the evidence and the conclusions that follow from it. They are not interested in the truth. Rather, they are promoting a political line, the anti-Stalin paradigm. People who push a political line instead of the truth tend to assume that everyone else is acting in the same dishonest manner. So they will call this book pro-Stalin, Stalinist, etc. as though I too were pushing some political line. But they are wrong. I am not promoting any political line or position. I am only interested in the truth. I strive for objectivity as much as any scientist. I try hard to question my own biases and prejudices, and to give an especially generous reading to any evidence that tends to cast doubt upon those prejudices or that tends to disprove the hypotheses I have chosen to test in my research. For many years now, I have been searching for evidence that Stalin committed crimes. I search for it in the only legitimate way, by identifying, locating, obtaining, and studying primary source evidence, and then by drawing logical conclusions from that evidence. Likewise, I have given Trotsky every benefit of the doubt in my research. No one cares what Sherlock Holmes's politics are. We just want him to solve the mystery. Likewise, my own political opinions are irrelevant. Nevertheless, those who are unwilling to consider the possibility that their own preconceived ideas are mistaken will reject the results of my research in this book as in my other works. To all others, the vast majority, I submit this research and the conclusions based upon it. I welcome your comments and especially your criticisms. That's the end.
Thank you, Grover. Thank you very much for this informative presentation from you. What we will do, we'll have a break when Jean and maybe Rich Fallenbaum will speak briefly, Jean about the upcoming program and Rich Fallenbaum about collecting donations from you all, as we does take some money to run the program. So then we'll return to questions and go first answers. And I will ask everyone to please stick to the talk and address those questions. So with that, Jean, please go ahead with your announcements.
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Okay, they say they can't start my
Is Richard?
video, but
Okay.
yeah. But if
Yes.
I'm unmuted, that's fine. You can hear me. Okay, well, thank you very much, Grover. That was superlative as we expected. And really thank you for putting all the time and effort into pursuing this research. And it certainly benefits all of us. But we have some more. I want us to talk a little bit about what we have coming up. Because we have some good programs. Next week, our comrade from India, Abhinav Sinha, we've invited him to speak on the international working class, specifically India, and I hope you'll get into recent events in India. Following that, on the 27th, Kambi Sahai, one of the founders of our institute, he will be here to speak on freedom and democracy, which should be very interesting. And then on January 3rd, we have an open planning meeting for us to get together, talk about what happened in 2020, and discuss our hopes and fears for 2021. And everyone's welcome to participate. And we also welcome concrete proposals for programs and other things. So I hope people will be able to make that. Then coming up, our schedule is still not quite clear, but we have invited Michael Roberts, the Marxist economist, who will talk about the story of the year of the COVID and what now for 2021. And I spoke to Rick Sterling, who's been here a lot, and he's been down in Venezuela monitoring the elections there. So we have some good programs coming up. Is Richard here to speak about the...
No, I don't think Richard is in today.
Okay, well...
Doesn't look like I haven't seen Richard.
Okay, I'm going to see if I can find that blurb and put it in our
Chat.
into the chat. Sometimes it's problematic, but it's also in the mailing that we put out every week. So if you we do need money, and I tend to be a soft sell person. That's why they don't let me talk about this much. But please do consider um, uh, sending us some money, and you can do that through PayPal. And Sharon, did you want to say something about the library and the tax situation?
Thank you. So the library is
Unmute yourself, Sharon.
I did. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. The library, the Nebel Proctor Library is a separate institution from ICSS, and we're now asking for money for ICSS. But the library is a 501c3 charitable organization. So if you would like to give a substantial amount to the library, with some of it going to ICSS, we can split it. We can accept your whole donation and then give whatever you're designating to ICSS. We're willing to do that, but not for small amounts, because there's a administrative cost of doing all that, and we are run completely by volunteers. So I hope you understand. But you could contact me privately in the chat if you have more questions about that. One other thing that people should know, fewer people these days are able to claim deductions on their actually get a tax relief because of the tax law that was passed by the Trump administration. However, in the CARES Act, there's a provision that even people who do not enumerate their deductions can have $300 of a separate deduction for charities. So a lot of people haven't heard about that, and that's why I'm mentioning it. So if you want to give us $300, we're happy to accept it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And so now we open for questions and comments. And Sharon, do you, your hand was only for this, or do you want to be the first one to comment or question? Go ahead.
Unmute yourself, please.
No.
Incidentally,
Go ahead.
that info is in the chat now. I didn't manage to get it up there, so please consider that.
Okay.
That's all.
Okay, Sharon, do you
Just a
want
reminder,
to lead off the question,
just a reminder that we will be following, people's raising their hands, and you can do that through the participants icon on the bottom of your screen, and you can raise your hand there. So I think Raj is going to moderate who's going to be speaking, and I may have to send you a notice just to, asking you to unmute yourselves so that this can go in an orderly fashion. Thank you very much.
Go ahead, Sharon, please go ahead, unmute yourself.
Thank you. So thank you, Grover. As usual, it was very illuminating. So here's my question. So Trotsky and others conspired to weaken the Soviet Union in the fight against the Nazis, against fascism, in many different ways, as you have discovered. My question is, how much do you think they succeeded? What did they add to the Nazis' cause? Because a lot of what they conspired about did not succeed. They didn't kill Stalin, etc. So I'm just wondering how much, aside from the facts that they conspired, how much actually should we blame them for?
Okay. You want me to answer, Raj? Is this
Yeah, go ahead if you prefer to take another question, but I think you should go ahead with this.
Yeah.
Victor Wallace will be following you.
Sure.
There are not many hands, so you can take one at a time.
Sure. Well, I mean, the big issue, that's a big question. It's a good question. Certainly, there was a lot of destruction at various industrial sites. Certainly the collaborators among the military did some harm to the Red Army. I think that the opposition in the Soviet Union in general slowed down the progress of the reforms, such as collectivization, for example, which proved to be beneficial in the long run. One lesson seems to be that there's going to be opposition. That simply having a democratic centralist party doesn't do away with opposition. And I think that we need to figure out ways of dealing with opposition in constructive ways. However, I think the main issue with the Trotskyist and the other very serious oppositions in the Soviet Union in the 1930s was this. The opposition to the capitalist world was such that there was a widespread opinion, even in the leading ranks of the Bolshevik Party, that the Soviet Union could not last. And therefore, some sorts of deals had to be made with the powerful bourgeois capitalist countries. And it emerged in 1933 that, I should say 1934, that Germany was the most powerful and the closest of these countries, and therefore some sort of deal had to be made. So I think the origins of a lot of this opposition was a lack of faith that the Soviet Union could survive, and that proved wrong. But it didn't prove wrong by a whole lot, right? I mean, it was a narrow thing. The book I mentioned, The Great Conspiracy by Sayers and Kahn. I'm sure many of you know it, and if not, it's easily available as a used book. Turns out to be very accurate. It's astounding to read of the
I would like to talk.
Can you wait? Can you wait a little bit?
No, there's
it's astounding to read of the extent to which the extent of the anti-communist and anti-Soviet conspiracies emanating from the capitalist world, and then how the opposition within the Soviet Union linked up to that overtly anti-communist capitalist opposition. And it turns out that book is actually very accurate. I spent some years back in the late 1980s trying to verify or disprove statements in that book, and it's pretty amazing. But I don't have a neat answer for you. Clearly, the material harm that was done was significant, but ultimately the Soviets prevailed.
Okay, so I just wanted to add, I think there was considerable sabotage in the economic field, and I think in the military, the trials showed that the military was affected and had to clean it out. So that was a cost.
Totally
They did overcome it.
unintelligible.
So I will go to Victor Wallace.
He's muted.
Victor Wallace is next. Please, Victor Wallace, you come up with your. Yeah, I'm Victor Wallace. Could you please unmute yourself? Victor?
Perhaps you could turn on my camera as well. Yeah. So I didn't mean to be without a camera. Thank you. It's always interesting to hear what you have to say, Grover. And I guess you say
you have to turn on your own camera. I don't think we can do.
No, everything's fine now.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Well, I did my best. Anyway, you say you demonstrate that there's no evidence that Stalin committed crimes, and yet you do acknowledge that crimes were committed really on a considerable scale during that period, hundreds of thousands of people being put to death, and you attribute it to Yezhov. And my question, which I've asked you this before, but I'm still not sure that I understand the answer, is the issue has to do with the system as a whole and not with whether or not you can directly attribute particular outcomes to one individual. And so I wonder how you how you interpret, really, finally, the fact that so many hundreds of thousands of people were put to death for political reasons within a space of a couple of years.
Sure. Well, I wrote a book about this called Yezhov versus Stalin. So if you want to see the details and the evidence and so forth, you should read it. The so-called Great Terror, which was Yezhov, what's called in Russia the Yezhovshchina, when Yezhov massacred hundreds of thousands of people, occurs in the context that Sharon mentioned, that is to say, of the opposition. There was, and particularly of the military opposition, but also the opposition within the party. So there was a lot of opposition within the leading ranks of the party. And then the military conspiracy showed that there was a lot of opposition within the leading ranks of the military. And the one organization that appeared to be reliable was the NKVD, and armed, of course. And Yezhov took advantage of this. And you can read the details in my book. I have even more details on my webpage. 10 years ago now, I transcribed and translated and put online, both in Russian and English, all of the interrogations and confessions that Yezhov himself made. So they're available, and then there's some more information in my book, Yezhov versus Stalin. The central leadership was in Moscow, and they were getting reports from around the country, and these reports were detailed, and they seemed reliable, but they were not reliable. They were false reports Yezhov and company were sending in. Now, they did send out, this is not an excuse, they didn't manage to, of course they made a mistake, they didn't manage to find out what Yezhov and company were doing for over a year. They did send out people to inspect, but the people who were inspected were also lied to. So it was, as you say, it was a systemic problem. The Soviet Union during this period was put under really threat, and I mentioned this in the book, a threat that really no other government has ever faced. You know, high-level treason by leaders of the party, including some people in the government, by leaders of the military, and then by leaders of the Commissariat of Internal Affairs, including the political police. So this was I would say this combination of events was one that it's very difficult to imagine that any political system, any political structure, any administrative or institutional structure could withstand. And it's amazing that they withstood it. It's amazing that it didn't collapse. It's amazing that Stalin stayed in power and wasn't overthrown and so forth, given the extent of the conspiracies against him. There's a Russian historian named Yuri Zhukov, who wrote some years ago that it was a very close thing, and that if Stalin had been successfully executed, arrested and killed, which was of course the goal of the oppositionists, then today, and he's talking about 18, 19 years ago, then today we would be sitting around talking about the need to rehabilitate Stalin. Okay, That's how close it was. So I don't really have I don't really have an alternative scenario, what the Soviets could have done back in the 1920s, maybe early 1930s, to escape, to avoid all of these fatal, potentially fatal issues. I do think that there are a lot of lessons to be learned from studying the Soviet experience. And, but I'm not sure that with that combination of forces arrayed against you, that I'm not sure they didn't do the best that could have been done. I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. If you're finished with your answer,
Yeah.
I will go to the next person. Sandeep's hand was up, but I don't see he's up now, so I'll go to Elazar. Elazar, you're next. Please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Elazar.
All right. The problem I have with Grover
Yes.
Furr, I'm a bit hoarse. I apologize. I'll do the best I can. Is that what he calls primary source evidence is the archives of the Soviet Union, who were, for whatever reason, the deadly enemies of what I call true Trotskyism, not Alan Wald, academic talker. I'm talking about revolutionary Trotskyists. I think conflating the anti-Stalin paradigm of the imperialists with revolutionary Trotskyism an error. One error I can bring out, is Grover saying that Ryazhov acted behind the back of Stalin. The primary source evidence, as recorded by anti-totalitarian scholars, such as Sally Stoker, J.R. Getty, do not support Grover's assertion that the so-called Yezhovshchina was done behind the back of Stalin. Now, my primary source evidence was the Communist Party of the United States during the period of Stalin's life. Stalin had an enormous influence. I'm not talking about agents controlling the U.S. party. That's a right-wing crap. I'm talking about he had enormous moral authority. When they kicked out the Japanese communists out of the party, supported the internment of the Japanese Nikkei community, and called them fifth columnists inside the Daily Worker, that is what the kind of stuff I oppose. The fact that Stalin was strong, powerful, and attacked his opponents, that didn't bother me. What bothered me was so-called peaceful coexistence with imperialism. Grover already proved that U.S., French, and British policy was to shove the Nazis down the throat of the Soviet Union. I agree with them there. And Trotskyists are delighted and support the fact that it was mainly the Soviet Union that crushed the Nazi spine. And also, they beat the Nazis in an intelligence war. It didn't end because the Trotskyists, by the way, who went to their deaths singing the Internationale and saluting in death camps inside the Soviet Union. So I don't agree. I would readily accept information that was solid that proved that Trotsky, I met the Trotskyist leaders who ran the Minneapolis strike. I met authentic Trotskyists. The movement decayed. Yes, it's true under the SWP. But I don't like the fact that Grover will not support an anti-fascist united front with the likes of the former Spartacus League, the Bolshevik tendency who united with the Communist Party at Pier 80 to stop the apartheid cargo. and the internationalist group whose leaders and supporters closed down the entire Canadian American West Coast to protest the murder of George Floyd. I have many other disagreements. Certainly Sayers and Kahn were known to be liars within the party. Because I tried to join the Viet Minh, my family put me in therapy. I demanded a communist therapist. Aaron Hilkovich was in the Spanish Civil War a surgeon. He told me that was widely known in the party that Sayers and Kahn were fabricators and liars. That's my primary source information. Thank you.
Time's up.
Sorry, I'm hoarse. I have to lower my hand. I don't know.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, let me just,
So
a lot of stuff. I'm not going to try to
respond.
I'm not going to try to respond to everything. The problem with Trotskyists is not only them, but that's what we're discussing today because of the topic is my book, is that they didn't have any evidence to reject what the Soviets were saying, what the Stalin government, if you want to put it that way, was saying about the conspiracies and the trials and so forth. They didn't have any. They didn't have any basis to reject it. So they were going on faith, and that's still the case. You know, the Trotskyist movement. Don't take this personally. I don't mean you personally, but the Trotskyist movement is a cult. They believe what Trotsky said, and I've proven in my books that Trotsky was lying all over the place. So it was an error to believe Trotsky in this uncritical way, and they continue to do so. Sayers and Kahn's book is excellent. I don't care who you cite. I took a lot of time in the 1980s to verify, to check up the statements that were made in Sayers and Kahn's book, The Great Conspiracy. And I checked almost all of them, all the ones that seemed at all shaky to me. It's a very reliable book. Now, we know a lot more now because of the opening of the Soviet archives. I say we, I should really say I, but because not many people read these Soviet archives. That's why I published my books. But now, what happened here is this. Khrushchev gave a speech, and as a result, Sayers and Kahn were told that they had to repudiate their book. They had to repudiate the book, The Great Conspiracy. In other words, if you accept Khrushchev, and in order to stay within the communist movement, you had to accept Khrushchev's speech and whatever the Soviet leadership said, then it follows that Sayers and Kahn's book is full of lies. But the fact of the matter is, it's the other way around. Sayers and Kahn's book is actually reliable. It's Khrushchev and the Soviet leadership that were lying, and the phony historians, and of course the Western historians who picked up on what they were saying and repeated it. So it's false. I don't care who says it. I don't care if if Getty says it, or you mentioned a few other names. If they say Sayers and Kahn are lying, they're wrong. Okay, I've checked. Sayers and Kahn are accurate. Those people are talking through their hats. So let me just leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Mark Albertson is next.
Yes, Professor Furr.
Mark, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, Professor Furr, thank you for your talk. In a little bit of a different vein, I do historical research at a military magazine, and I've done I've done quite a bit of research on the Soviets, which in that period of the 1930s with their program of industrialization, and I've come to the realization here that Soviet industrial production in what we call the Second World War was one of the biggest secrets for Allied victory in that war over Nazi Germany and imperialist Japan. Lend-Lease was really only 10–12% of the Soviet effort on the war on the Eastern Front. But it's the war on the Eastern Front. You know, it's the greatest land war in modern times. And it's the Soviets that actually win the land war. Mm-hmm. We don't. They do. You know, that's not decided in the Pacific or North Africa or Sicily or Italy or France. Even after Normandy, France was a secondary front. But it's the Red Army, the Soviet army, that really defeats the German army. I mean, all you got to do is walk through German cemeteries, Gefallen Kursk, Gefallen Stalingrad, Gefallen Odessa. 80% of the German dead were where? Eastern Front. And I just like your opinion on that.
Wow, I don't have. I'm sure I don't know nearly as much about the war on the Eastern Front as you do. I haven't studied that period of Soviet history, and I particularly haven't studied it from a military historical viewpoint. I think you're right about Lend-Lease. I mean, quite a few people say that about Lend-Lease. I've never studied Lend-Lease, but it seems to be that there's a general agreement that Lend-Lease was important but not critical aid that the United States gave to the Soviet Union. Sure. At the end of World War II, I believe it was as early as June 1945, Winston Churchill ordered a plan called Operation Unthinkable. You probably know about that, which was a plan to immediately rearm the German army and get the Allied armies to all team up with the German army and attack the Soviets.
Right.
I'm not clear on why they didn't do it. They didn't go through with it. Probably it seemed like the soldiers would not go along with that. It would be, it wasn't really a feasible plan, but they made it. And the basic documents were published, within the last 20 years or so.
So it would be George Kennan who would say that Stalin is not the new Hitler.
Yeah. Oh,
They can't go on a binge of world conquest.
Yeah.
They've really been hit hard by the Germans in 4 years, so they can't do it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Which led to containment later on.
Sure. I mean, the degree of hostility among the Western imperialist powers to the communist movement, the world communist movement, and the Soviet Union is it's breathtaking. It's impossible to exaggerate. There were times during the war when this alliance threatened to fall apart. I mean, I was just discussing with someone the other day the German plot to assassinate Hitler in the summer of 1944, and how the leaders of that plot are heroes within, or are said to be heroes within Germany today. These were all generals and high-ranking officials who wanted to make a separate peace with the West and then turn around and attack the Soviets. That's what they wanted to do.
Right.
And Hitler, of course, didn't want to do that. He refused, and that's why they wanted to kill him. So these people are heroes, but they were fanatic anti-communists, and they were only really opposed to Hitler when it was clear that he was going to lose the war.
Right.
So the extent of anti-communist hostility in these among the Allies is can't be overstated.
Yeah, but at the same time, with the way the war proceeded,
yeah.
Churchill always had those nightmares from the first part of the war. Passchendaele, Ypres. Sure. They couldn't do that again. Britain would have been totally finished. They couldn't do that again. Henceforth, that's why you want the Soviet army to take on the German army.
Yeah, one of the things that I mentioned, and I just mentioned it in my talk, and of course it's also in the conclusion of my book, is that this idea of imagining what it would have been like if Trotsky had succeeded. Okay, if Trotsky and the other conspirators had succeeded in allying with Nazi Germany and the Axis, getting the Soviet Union to either ally with them or let it be taken over by Germany and Japan completely. How the world would have been different. Okay, so the Soviets really, and I say the Soviets really saved us. Stalin, if you want to put it that way. Stalin saved the world twice, not just during the war, but in crushing this conspiracy, which would have been devastating to the working class and many, many others all around the world. And I think that just has some bearing on the issue that Elazar raised about Trotskyism. Trotskyism was outlawed in the Soviet Union pretty early on, and it's been said and thought and written about since then that, oh, this was terrible, this was no good, and so forth. But now we know that the Soviets actually had good evidence that Trotskyism was a deeply fascist movement within the Soviet Union. Yes, sure, they called themselves the true communists, but they were a deeply fascist movement. The Soviets had no way of knowing, the communist movement had no way of knowing how much the Trotskyists around the world knew. I published an article a year or so ago about Spain, about the Spanish Civil War.
Oh, yeah.
And, it's on my webpage, you can download it. And one of the things I point out is that the Soviets, really went after the POUM after the May Day in Barcelona of 1937. And the POUM, the most active people in the POUM were Trotskyists. And they really went after them because as far as they were concerned, the Trotskyists were all in league with the Nazis because they knew that Trotsky was. Now, we can't prove today that all of the Trotskyist leaders were in fact in league, consciously in league with the Nazis, just because Trotsky was. But the Soviets didn't know that at that time. They had already said it's a crime to belong to a Trotskyist movement because this is a fascist movement that's conspiring with Nazi Germany and Japan. And therefore, if you were a Trotskyist, you were presumed to be a Nazi ally. And so they really went after the POUM, and they had good reason. That was their reason to do it, and they were right to do it. The Tukhachevsky affair trial had just taken place, and I have a chapter in this book, the book that we're talking about here, where I discuss all of the statements about Trotsky that were made by the defendants in the Tukhachevsky affair trial. And they indict Trotsky as one of the leaders of this conspiracy over and over and over again. They give details. They talk about meetings with his son, and and it's not faked, and nobody's putting these words in their mouths. So then, that's when the Soviets start to really go after the Trotskyists in Spain. Up until that time, they kept an eye on. They hadn't done that much. That's when they really go after them. They kidnap, I think, or arrange to have kidnapped some of their leaders, like Erwin Wolf and some others, and they're disappeared. They shoot Andres Nin. Andres Nin had been very close to Trotsky. There's no reason to think that he wasn't a Nazi conspirator. Whether he really was or not, the point is that Trotsky certainly was. And they just decided that the Trotskyist movement was this fascist criminal movement. Today, we don't know how much these non-Soviet Trotskyists, Trotskyists in the movement outside the Soviet Union knew. But what we do know is that they were essentially believing everything that Trotsky said and calling Stalin, a totalitarian, just like Hitler and stuff like this. So I think these primary source documents that show that the Soviets were acting in completely good faith in prosecuting the oppositionists and in identifying Trotsky as one of the major leaders of this very, very dangerous opposition. I think that shows that they had every reason to act in the way that they were acting during this period of time. And by the way, there's some evidence. I don't say it's conclusive. There's some evidence that Trotsky was still in touch with the Germans even after this period, right up until 1939 or 1940. Certainly, the Soviet government thought that if Trotsky were still alive when the Germans attacked, he would play a very destructive role in dividing working class opinion, dividing working class support around the world against the Soviets. We know that the Finnish government discussed in January 1940, inviting Trotsky to form a provisional government of the Soviet Union, and a parallel government of the Soviet Union, so that I think this is probably the reason why the Soviets had Trotsky assassinated in 1940, because the war was coming on and he was bound to play a very dangerous role in that war.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So we will go to Jean Rule. And after Jean Rule, we have Marilyn Langlois. So Jean, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I mean,
Eugene,
say again?
you're next.
I'm not muted, am I?
Nope, you're okay.
Okay. No, this is very, very interesting, and I really appreciate the fact that there are people discussing this who know much more than I do about the whole situation, particularly during the war and so on. So it's very useful for me, and I thank everybody that's talking here. But I want to just remind, go back a little bit, because both Grover and I think many of us share a certain experience back during the period of the war in Vietnam. And I personally came of age during that period. And we were trying to figure out, well, why was this going on? What was happening here? And we had, the mainstream media had their view. And it was probably just on the basis of that, it's sort of hard to contest that. But at the same time, we had a movement. The anti-war movement was very strong, and they put forth an alternative point of view, an alternative narrative about that war, which we now, I think probably everybody in this room agrees, and many people, it's widely accepted the fact that this was a imperialist war waged by a racist imperialist power against a communist country. That was only trying to, determine its own future. And that paradigm, that narrative, I think is extremely powerful. And it's very much like the situation we have today when we have an imperialist power doing this. So I think we need to sometimes look at this big picture that's emerging and how the movement that we represent, we are involved with, is developing an alternative point of view to what might be called the dominant paradigm and so on. And I have to say also, I appreciate all the work that Grover's done. I did try to do a little bit. I remember people were saying how bad communism was and referring to the Black Book on Communism. I don't know if people know that book, but I did check it out, looked it over, and God, you would not believe. It only took a few hours to look through it and see, well, they cite a lot of evidence, quote, evidence that, there are these travelers in this province that came back and they said, things are real bad here in Siberia. Then there's hundreds of people facing starvation. Okay, so what they do is say, okay, let's say 700 people died here because of communism. And then there's another battle in which the White Army killed 500 members of the Red Army because they were communists. Okay, here's another 500 people killed because of communism. And that's the level of some of this research. And,
It's time's up.
Okay, well, I just want to say that, and I also appreciate that we need to know what the Soviet Union accomplished, not only in destroying fascism, but also in providing a very good living for the Soviet people after the war. And we've talked about that here also. Thank you again.
So before we go to Marilyn, I just wanted to make a comment that I have read Trotsky's writings on Spain. And what I came across amazing in his own writings is that his thesis was that the communists should be opposed to the Republican government because they will be worse enemies than the fascists who were actually attacking Spain. I found it really amazing that he will go to the extent of saying the main enemy is actually the allies of the communists. And to me, that was clearly the way Trotsky functioned. He had ability to represent what was actually counter-revolutionary in a revolutionary phrasing, a revolutionary formulation. because he said, well, this will be more revolutionary because the workers will have a greater enemy with this bourgeoisie of with them, their allied, and that's how he justified to his followers the May Day revolt. And I have that book here, and I was amazed to read that. I wasn't anti-Trotsky, but I said, you know, this makes no common sense what he was arguing. Until I read further, then I realized that there was a plan behind it. Anyway, Marilyn, you are next.
Okay, hello. I'd like to turn on my video, but I can't. It says the host has turned me off. So if there's any way that the host can turn my video on, that would be great. Otherwise, I'll just speak. Thank you very, very much, Grover. As always, I really, really appreciated your presentation and look forward to your new book. My question is about actually the period following Trotsky's life. When you mentioned Churchill's plan, the unthinkable, what it made me think of is that while overtly it was not carried out, but wasn't it actually carried out covertly in the guise of NATO's secret armies and the whole Operation Gladio, of which there, you know, Daniele Ganser, a Swiss historian, has written extensively about it. Also, Richard Cottrell and Paul Williams have written books about it, whereby US NATO countries planted stay-behind armies of fascists who had arms caches in every single Western European country. And what they did is they sabotaged any advances, democratic advances made by communist parties, and committed horrible acts of terrorism and blamed them on leftists and that sort of thing. So my question, do you have any sense of any of the Trotskyist movements played any role in this whole Operation Gladio covert actions carried out by NATO?
Well, the answer is no.
Before you start, Grover, I'm sorry. No, it's not this, the hosts have disabled your video. I think you can do it yourself, but Zoom, I think, is very, very sluggish today. And even, you know, our commands are taken very slowly. So that may be the cause of it. Thank you.
No problem, no problem. I just wish, but I'm glad I can see your face at least. But anyway, so yes, go ahead.
No, I haven't researched that. I know that that's an important issue. The important thing to do is to research the history of imperialism, Western imperialism, including anti-communism in the 20th century, but particularly since World War II. And there's really a large literature about it. And I'm not saying that that isn't important, but there's only so much one individual can do. And for better or worse, I've chosen to concentrate on researching Stalin and the Stalin period and the allegations of crimes against Stalin and so forth, because I'm able to do it. I have the languages and I have access to to archival documents and stuff like that. I don't mean to say that it's the only important thing to do at all. So yes, you're indicating, you're right to indicate that those are very important issues. I find my students, and not only my students, but my colleagues, people in general, even very educated people, know very little about the real history of the extent of the atrocities and brutality of Western imperialism, even since World War II. It's just not widely publicized. There are books and articles about it, but it's not taught, so people don't know it. Just like what's the truth about the Soviet Union is not, it's not written about, it's not taught. The documents that I cite are available to plenty of people, but they won't use them, they won't cite them. So that our understanding of history generally is very, very inaccurate. We're the victims of capitalist, imperialist propaganda, anti-communist propaganda, and it takes a lot of effort to uncover it. And then there's the question of when people write books about these topics, such as the ones you mentioned, Gladio and others. How many people actually read those books? And what sort of impact do they have? One of the things that I've found, and it's interesting to me, is that because I've been writing about Stalin and investigating the allegations against Stalin and proving that so far in every case that I've investigated that the allegations are false, that these are lies, I've come in for a lot of abuse, a lot of attacks, which have taken many forms. I think that the question of Stalin, therefore, is a particularly important question, important not only to those of us on the left, but important to the defenders of capitalism and imperialism around the world. It's a kind of icon that can't be touched. That has to be revered. That can't be displaced. So much of pro-capitalist, anti-communist, pro-imperialist propaganda depends upon a demonized view of Stalin. That when I started years ago to dismantle it, sort of piece by piece, with the aid of the evidence we now have, I encountered a lot of resistance, a lot. I mean, my Facebook page has been attacked, not my Facebook page, my Wikipedia page has been attacked and defaced and so forth and so on. I think more than that of actual leaders of communist parties around the world. I've checked a little bit. It's astounding to me that questioning the lies against Stalin, the lies about Stalin, makes so many reactionaries so upset that I think it's an important, it's a sign that that's an important job to do. But it's not the only important job. Of course, you mention other acts by the imperialist powers and the capitalist powers, and those are important. And someone mentioned the Black Book of Communism, and that's another piece of atrocity. That was Gene Rule, I think, another atrocity. Much of this stuff that comes out, like the Black Book, is not really aimed at academics. It's aimed at the mass media. The mass media are not qualified to pass judgment on stuff like this, but they do it anyway. I wrote a book dissecting Timothy Snyder's book, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. I wrote another book a couple of years ago dissecting volume 2 of Stephen Kotkin's biography of Stalin. I show that these so-called experts at Ivy League universities basically do nothing but lie. But they get fabulous reviews in the mass media, because what do these reviewers know? The reviewers are completely unequipped. If they wanted to be honest, they were unequipped to evaluate these books properly, and so they just praise them. So they leapfrog over academic discussion and go straight to propaganda, straight to the mass media. And so this question of Stalin is among the important questions, and it's the one that I feel that I can do. But I certainly don't mean to belittle other important issues such as the ones you mentioned.
Thank you.
Okay, so I don't see any hand up, so maybe it's time that I allow myself to say something here.
Sure.
And I have Grover comment on it. So a couple of things. One is that the American ambassador who was during the trials, the Moscow trials, was a man by name
Joseph Davies.
Joseph Davies, thank you. Joseph Davies writes in his book that when he went as an ambassador, appointed ambassador, he stopped by in Germany.
Yeah.
And he, as is normally, you report to the ambassador. He's going there, so first thing you have to do is report to the ambassador. And they had dinner there and so forth. The ambassador invited the German Foreign Office people and Soviet also for dinner. And then the German extended him the courtesy. So he went to German Foreign Office to visit. And he stopped by the Soviet desk of German Foreign Office. And so German Foreign Office person in charge of Soviet desk said, what do you think about this Stalin government stability? And Joseph Davis said, to the best of my knowledge, it's sound, it's good. And I think this is around 1936, early 1936, that he's talking to him. And to which the German foreign officer in charge of Soviet Union said, well, your information needs to be checked. I mean, you need to verify, look into it a little more. Our information is there is a lot of revolutionary activity which will soon break out into the open. So he records that. Davies goes back, reports it to the ambassador, US ambassador, that's what I heard. And then he went on to Soviet Union, and then he talked to the British ambassador about it. And the British ambassador kind of hedged his bets. He wasn't sure, he didn't know, so he didn't say anything, or he was diplomatically didn't want to reveal what he knew. But this is a clear indication the German Foreign Office knew something was going on. So this idea that there didn't exist a conspiracy, it was all hatched by NKVD to eliminate Stalin's enemies, is not supported by some independent external evidence also. So the other thing I wanted to say is that Yezhov, Victor Wallace raised a question about Yezhov, which is very interesting and a good question about how is it that a Central Committee member so trusted, Yezhov, is doing all this behind Stalin and Central Committee's back. For what purpose? What was he going to gain out of it? And isn't it convenient that Stalin can just simply blame a guy that had him killed? This is what these Trotsky's followers, Trotsky's say, or other bourgeoisie say that, well, it was convenient. He had him do it and then he got rid of him. Well, you have to study Yezhov's life to see how complicated the whole subject is. And Yezhov was a street urchin in Poland when he was growing up. He didn't have parents. He apparently was street urchin. Either parents died or something. And then, as it is, he was abused. You know what happens to young boys to streets, So he was sodomized, abused, sexually abused, and all sort of things he did. And then he found his home in the Soviet Communist Party. And all of a sudden, he had a home. And when he grew up, he became a worker, grew up, and there he worked his heart out. And he was organizationally very good, so he rose up. So it was sort of like the only institution of home that he knew was the Soviet Communist Party. So he rose very high in the rank. He was a worker. So he was trusted and he did a good job. And yet the Polish intelligence and therefore also the German intelligence knew his past. One of the things he was compromised was his bisexuality and all that. So these factors are there. But the greatest factor is that he had ambition. He thought he would be replacing Stalin. I'm not sure that he wanted to have Stalin killed because it would be easy for him to arrange that. But I don't know what his plan was. But he was compromised, for one thing. Secondly, there was ambition. He wasn't necessarily. So I want you to comment, Grover, what do you know about Yezhov that you can address that Victor Wallace's question on Yezhov? Because Yezhov is certainly a person under whom the maximum amount of repressions occurred, and somewhere over 200 to 600,000 people died. Not all of them were, of course, innocent. Most of them were kulaks and other elements. But anyway, your comments on this.
Well, I wrote a book on this, and and it's full of primary source evidence, and I can't summarize it now. What you say about Yezhov is pretty much as I understand it. He made some statements after his arrest in 1939 about his youth, and more or less along the lines of what you're stating. But he was trapped, if you want to put it that way, into doing espionage for the Germans, and evidently, according to what he said, also for Poland, pretty early on the basis of his past. And so there's that personal aspect to it, but I think there's also the issue that he was ambitious. And the feeling not among the rank and file necessarily of the communists and the working class in the Soviet Union, but the feeling among many of the communist officials was that the Soviets were doomed, that they couldn't survive an attack by the fascists. And of course, Trotsky also said that, and that was something that many Soviet officials agreed with him. I think there's a number of people, including Trotsky and Sedov, his son, who expressed the view. Certainly Radek and Bukharin said that they were sure that the collectivization movement, the industrialization movement, the 5-year plans, and then on top of that, the famine of 1932-33 were going to be too much. The Stalin government would collapse. Civil war would break out. This would be an opportunity for the opposition, including, with or without Trotsky, for the opposition to take control of the party. And that didn't happen. And when it didn't happen, they really had two ways to go. They could have just dropped their opposition, or they could have, upped the ante, said, okay, well, now we have to go for assassination or for a coup d'etat and for making deals. They have to make deals with Germany and Japan because these are the governments who may intervene, are most likely to invade. If we have a civil war, if we do seize power, if we don't make a deal with them first, we have to make a deal with them first. And Trotsky said that, but the others agreed with him that was necessary. Yagoda, who was not a Trotskyist, said the same thing. He was a rightist. And Bukharin said the same thing. It's obvious that once we've decided to overthrow the Stalin government by hook or by crook, we have to make deals. We have to make deals with the Germans and Japanese, and then of course we have to make the deals with the Americans, with the British and the French, to balance out the Germans and the Japanese. Try to play them off against each other. So they talk about that in the trial transcripts and on other documents we have now. So I don't think it's in one sense, it's as Victor suggested, it's a failure of the system. On the other hand, I don't think that any system can be structured so as to withstand the kinds of betrayal in high places on the scale that it took place in the Soviet Union. In some sense, it's amazing that one or the other of these conspiracies didn't succeed. I think it's a testimony to the fact that the vast majority of the party and the vast majority of the working class, and certainly many of the peasants too, were behind the government. But that was the situation. There was this tremendous opposition, and it has to have something to do with what happens later on in Soviet history. When Khrushchev made that secret speech, he mentioned executions, what he called wrongful executions of a number of the communist leaders, a number of the party leaders and generals. But then as time went on, Khrushchev broadened that attack and he was not actively opposed, as far as we know, within the party. So I think that there were people who opposed to Stalin and his policies, going right back to the 30s, who were not stopped, who were not caught, who were not tried and removed from office or imprisoned or executed during the 1930s. I mentioned in the back of Khrushchev Lied, which is already, I wrote over 10 years ago now, that if Khrushchev himself had been part of had been a secret oppositionist during the 1930s, it would explain a lot of what he did. It would explain much of his opposition to Stalin and a lot of the political changes that he made. So there's a lot more to be discovered, but I think that this question of the role of Stalin is an important one, because by using it as a kind of window, by examining the evidence for the charges against Stalin and finding that they're false, as I have found that they are, we get insights into the depths, the extent of anti-communism in not only in the Soviet Union at that time, but elsewhere, and some hints as to why the Soviet leadership after Stalin's death took a sharp turn to the right, ultimately ending up in the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself. Mikhail Gorbachev certainly believed, I'm convinced of this, he believed that what Khrushchev was saying, and the Khrushchevites had said 25 years before him, were correct. He believed that Stalin was a monster. He accepted all of that stuff. He didn't have the evidence for it, so he started to invent evidence for it. But he believed it. And so the Soviet Party, starting during Stalin's time, many of the leaders of the Soviet Party had a what you'd call a rightist or a pro-capitalist political line, and ultimately that won out. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Before I go to Jean, who's next, I want to ask anybody who has not spoken. Do you have a question or comment before I go to Jean? Jean has spoken once before. Okay, no one. So Jean, go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Jean?
I just want to am I on?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just want to clarify something, because I did indicate that there are certain things that are being said in the mass media that I tend to just dismiss out of hand. But I think I didn't want to create the wrong impression. I think it's very useful and important to keep track on what the opposition sources, let me put it that way, are saying. And in particular, the work of Kropotkin, I think it is, I found kind of useful to dip into that now and then, and particular in terms of there's this, well, one thing he says in the book is that, we usually have the picture of Stalin as kind of a bumbling fool who didn't know what he was up to, and a semi-literate person is what picture Trotsky paints. But Kropotkin has this statement somewhere that, Stalin's libraries has something like 50,000 or maybe 5,000, I'm not sure, books in it. And they're not just up there for show. He actually read them, made notes in all of them and so forth. So he is a very wide read and careful reader. That's something I hadn't come across before. Also, in terms of what's known as Lenin's last will and testimony, Kropotkin says some interesting things about that, referring to some Soviet studies of the period, saying that claiming that that was a forgery. It was never really, those weren't really the words. That was mistranscribed and so forth. And apparently there was a lot of discussion about this, and the indication was they could neither be verified nor disproven what Lenin's actual words were. But I did come across an interesting source, which was Harry Haywood's book on the Black Bolshevik. And he was in Moscow at the time, and he actually attended one of the rallies on the anniversary of the revolution, in which Trotsky forces, this was in 1927, Trotsky's forces actually attempted a coup by throwing out all this literature, pamphlets saying, overthrow Stalin, he's no good and so forth, get rid of Stalin, which was an anti-party move. It was an attempted coup back in 1927, which is detailed in that book. And he was an eyewitness to this. And he says that, it's totally false. Trotsky was expelled because he tried a coup against the party. And the Trotskyist line is that is because of what he said.
Gene, we're running against time.
Can I just finish?
Wrap it up.
Yeah, I'm trying to. All I'm saying is the mainstream approach was that Trotsky was expelled for what he thought. No, he was expelled for what he did. So I just wanted to make that clear. Thank you.
Shall I reply?
Okay, Sharon Rose is next, and maybe you can respond to both Sharon.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Grover, or you want to wait till Sharon asks her comments?
Well, I want to say one thing briefly. By the way, I can't
Okay, Sharon, go ahead because we're running against time.
Turns out I can't turn my camera back on. I don't know why.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so I can't turn the camera back on, so it says the host has stopped in. So anyway, I won't turn it on. Very briefly about what Gene just said. Over the summer, I pretty much finished up this book on the Tukhachevsky affair, which I mentioned to you will be coming out hopefully in the next couple of weeks. Well, certainly within the next month, maybe within the next couple of weeks. And that was a lot of work, but I had a lot of time. We weren't going anywhere. No traveling was taking place. So for the last 2 years, I've been writing a book about researching and writing a book on Lenin's testament, using precisely the sources that Kotkin uses in volume 1 of his Stalin biography, which Gene just referred to. This is based largely on the published research of a Russian scholar who has written some articles and also a couple of books, the main book being over 700 pages long and Russian, very dense, with a zillion footnotes. And it occurred to me several years ago, 2017 or 2018, that if I didn't get to the bottom of this, if I didn't write this up, if I didn't research this and find out what's really going on here, clarify it in some way, no one was going to do it. Because how many people are going to sit down and read a 700-page book in Russian? And it's very dense and hard to read even in Russian, because it's like a lot of academic books are. So that's my project for 2021. I expect that by this time next year, maybe even a month or two earlier, I will have published that book, and it's on Lenin's testament, the last writings. And I think that there is no question that the works in Lenin's last writings that have these anti-Stalin remarks are in fact fakes. And it's a very interesting story. I don't want to say any more than that, but a year from now or so, that book should be out and we can talk about it. But you're right to focus on that. And one of the really interesting things about Stephen Kotkin is this. His volume 2 is terrible. And I wrote that book, Stalin Waiting for the Truth, about his volume 2 because it's full of falsifications. But there we go. But his volume 1 is not nearly so terrible, and it includes some very good things. And he clearly studied this question of Lenin's testament very, very carefully and read it with read the details with great care. So that spurred my interest even more. So I'll have that book ready, sometime in 2021. That's a very, very interesting story. And it gets into Trotsky again, of course. It's just a fascinating kind of detective story, the kind of stuff that I like to do. So I hope to have that ready in a year or so. I'm working on it now.
We look forward to your talk on that. So Sharon, you're next.
Thank you. So I just wanted to comment that the depth of anti-communism is endless. It's a bottomless pit in this country. I like to watch, or like is not the right word, I watch MSNBC and CNN to see what the American people are being fed. And there are two particular anti-communists on MSNBC. One is Joe Scarborough, the former Republican representative from New York, and Brian Williams, who is horrible in my opinion. But in any case, one of them, I can't remember which one, recently referred to all of the American fighters who were killed at the hands of the Nazis and the Soviets. And I'm screaming at the television, what are they talking about? What American troops were ever killed by the Soviets? And yet this is like a common thread. Our enemies that killed our forces. There's no distinction made between the Nazis and the Soviets. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's I mentioned that in my talk in March to the NPML before the big shutdown, right before everybody closed down. Once again, it was Trotsky who was the first to use the term totalitarian to refer to both the Soviet Union, the Stalin Soviet Union, and the fascist parties. And then this was picked up after the war, this use of the word totalitarian, and it but most famously by Hannah Arendt, but others too. Domenico Losurdo, the Italian Marxist communist philosopher who died a couple of years ago, he was a very prolific author. He wrote about this dishonest use of the term totalitarian to embrace meant to yoke communism together with Nazism, and he pointed out that really the similarities are really more between Nazism, fascism, and capitalism and imperialism, and that's where the similarities are really close. So he did some work in exposing that, but it needs to be done more widely. This term totalitarian is really a term that was specifically invented to apply to tie communism together with Nazism, and it has no independent meaning. It's basically just an insult. And yeah, it's pushed very hard. One of the things I said in my talk in March is that you should never pay. If you see that word, there are a bunch of other words that I talked about. If you see that word, somebody uses that word, you can write them off. They're not interested in the truth. That's propaganda. That's got nothing to do with any kind of real historical analysis.
And that word was actually initially used that charge was made by Trotsky.
Yeah, Trotsky was the first to make it, and I know that because I took that statement. I learned that statement by reading a very pro-Trotsky biography written in Russian by two scholars, Felshtinsky and Chernovsky, who started out life as Trotskyists. Of course, they're horrible anti-Stalinists. I don't know that they're Trotskyists in the strict sense any longer, but they're very, very friendly to Trotsky, and at one time were themselves Trotskyists in the Soviet Union. And they have this 4-volume biography of Trotsky, very well documented. And they come right out and say it. Yeah, Trotsky was the first to use the term totalitarian to apply to the Soviet Union.
I'll go to Norma, but I just wanted to say that even though the second volume of Stalin's biography by Kotkin is terrible and full of lies, and he calls him a despot without any kind of evidence.
Mhm.
At the same time, interestingly, he concludes in the book, all the bad things happen not just because of Stalin, because how do you explain one person, such a despotic person, and yet nobody gets rid of him? Because it'd be very easy. One person can be killed, shot, you know. He comes with a conclusion. This was the paranoia of the entire class, that is the working class. Now, this is kind of a left-handed compliment he's giving, if you look at it carefully. What he's saying is that working class of the USSR, once having gained the power, was not going to allow that power to slip away with enormous cost that it got it and knew what the consequences would be. And Stalin was a representative of that determination. So if you look at it, his research is interesting because on one hand, he wants to retain his position at a prestigious university. So he has to blow the bugle, anti-communist bugle. On the other hand, he's looking at these facts, and his intellectual side is also persuading him. So it's a conflicted personality, but on the whole, the book is full of lies. I agree with you. So Norma, you are next.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So in line with even with what Raj was just saying, I have used the word totalitarian to describe forcing people in revolutionary countries to have running water in their homes, to have health care, to have some productive relation to the social order, that is, so that they can survive. Is a very, very insistent, forceful way of saying, one, you have to participate and enjoy the benefits that have been won, and you can't work to overthrow the system. Very totalitarian kinds of behavior, I've told people. How are you, Grover? It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you for all your emails and
Right.
your support.
So I just, it's not, I don't even, I don't even have the intention, I don't even have the intention of reclaiming the word totalitarian. I just use it as a kind of way to gain attention, is all. And
Sarcasm.
yeah, and to Will, it's not just sarcasm, because I'm very strongly in support of everybody having running water in their home. Sure. and all those things.
So back to you, Grover. We still have 15 minutes for the program because we go up to 1 o'clock. So if you want to add to, because there's no one raised their hand to ask a question. So if you want to
sure, well,
share some more.
In conclusion, first of all, I put in the chat a link to the Amazon.com page of my book, the one that I talked about today, which is new evidence of Trotsky's conspiracy. Normally, when I am out there speaking to you in person, I bring copies, or I send them to Raj, and he's good enough to bring copies, or I send them to Ellen and John Murray, and they bring some copies. I can't do that now, but I did put a link to the Amazon page, and this is the front cover of the book. I think it would be good to get it into libraries if you have access. If you have contacts in libraries, if you use local libraries, to try to get some local libraries to publish it. And of course, you're welcome to read it yourselves. I'm always glad to get criticisms and comments, particularly some critical comments, because I really don't get many. I get people who say, we really like your work, and I get people who kind of curse me out, but that's not really a comment, and it's not really useful criticism either. So I would welcome useful criticism, and I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I am convinced that this evidence from the former Soviet archives is very important. I mentioned that soon we'll have I and my two co-authors, Vladimir Bobrov and Sven-Erik Holmstrom, will publish a book on the military conspiracy, the Tukhachevsky affair, with a complete translation into English done by Sven-Erik of the trial transcript, and then I think it's 15 chapters, it may only be 14 chapters of evidence, including a great deal of non-Soviet evidence, including the passage from Davies that Raj alluded to, but many other bits of non-Soviet evidence as well that confirm the existence of this military conspiracy and Trotsky's participation in it. And then I'm working on a book on the Lenin Testament. The working title is The Lie of the Lenin Testament, but I don't think I'm going to keep that title. But that's really what it is. It's very interesting that Lenin's last writings, some of Lenin's last writings are very clearly faked, forged, and that Kotkin himself, who of course is very anti-communist, nevertheless had enough perspicacity to see that that is the case. Previous to him, anti-communist historians have just embraced Lenin's last writings, the anti-Stalin sections or articles in Lenin's last writings, as showing that, you know, Stalin was a bad guy, even Lenin knew it. A Soviet scholar, a scholar of the Soviet Union named Moshe Lewin, who died, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, but who lived in the United States for many years and taught here, and was a very prominent Soviet scholar, wrote a book called Lenin's Last Struggle back in the late 1960s, in which he just basically followed the logic of those writings, those anti-Stalin writings in Lenin's last writings, and concluded, along with Trotsky, that Lenin really wanted Trotsky to run the Soviet Union, and that Soviet history would have been much better, and so forth and so on, if Trotsky had managed to take over. So that's all. It turns out that he made a lot of errors, and that's all completely false. But it's still very widely believed. These views about those last writings of Lenin are very widely credited. And so I think that's an important issue to delve into. And I hope to, talk to you guys about that in a year or something along those lines once the book has come out. So I really want to thank all of you for your support. Thank the NPML for hosting this lecture and my talks, and also the ICSS and Gene Rule for being kind enough to invite me many times. It's always a great pleasure for me, and an honor too, to speak to you all and to feel the support that you have for my work and my research.
We are very fortunate to be able to be in contact with you. We know that.
Thank you. I'm glad you feel that way, and I feel the same way towards you. This is a very important community for me, and even though we're separated by many miles, I hope we are able to get together after this COVID business is over. Suzanne and I will certainly come out there and visit her son and his family, and I hope to see you all in person. And once again, thank you very much for.
Don't hold your breath till you're able to travel.
Yeah, I understand.
This thing, whatever they're saying, this thing has got a couple of years before we can even begin to comprehend being safe,
Yes, I understand.
or to think of being safe.
I got you.
Grover, I just wanted to mention to you and others that of the videos we have put up on YouTube since 2011, which was the first video, was your talk on Khrushchev lied.
Yes.
All the top, every talk of yours is the one that's most watched. So actually, we are the beneficiary of your talk, because it not only we get informed, but we find that there's the greatest interest around, not only in this country but outside. Even though our YouTube presence is very, very small, but it's growing. And as I think many people here know, Grover's books have been translated, particularly Khrushchev lied, in so many languages. In India itself, 3 languages, unless there is another one, but 3 languages that I'm aware of. And so this point of view that has been established in the United States about Stalin is not necessarily shared everywhere, and certainly is not shared among the people who are poor and have been exposed to the ideas of communism. So this is a bourgeois propaganda, and petty bourgeoisie and those who are beneficiaries or who think they are beneficiaries of the system believe that. But those who are at the bottom of this heap, which is the vast majority, I don't think they quite believe it. So I think your work is very valuable, and I think for the next set of revolution, it will play a role by letting people know the actual history rather than the history of maligning the communist movement of the 20th century, foremost of which was, of course, the Soviet experiment on this, and which unfortunately collapsed or ended. Incidentally,
You know what? I feel that I would like to make a tribute. The way I found out that Stalin did not do all the things that he's alleged to have done was some 30 years ago, I think 25, 30 years ago, when my husband said so. My husband came from Irish working class people. His father worked for Standard Oil. Both folks emigrated, both from Mayo. And he just kind of knew that. I mean, he did read a whole lot of stuff, and he did have a sense going towards Marxism. I mean, we never got a chance to amplify it sufficiently because he goddamn died without asking me. But he just said, "Oh, no, Stalin didn't do those things." Great authority.
Yes, Gene?
Yeah, I just wanted to, first of all, remind Grover, thank him very much, and say he has a standing invitation to zoom back over to the West Coast and give another talk. But I also wanted to thank both Raj and Mehmet and Alan, who are our technical crew, and they've played such an important role in keeping us going since the pandemic hit. Not only keeping us going, but thriving. And again, as Raj says, we now have like 300 subscribers to this list, and from all over the country, from around the world, and around the nation, and around the world. So I want to thank them, and folks, come back next week.
Okay, well, thank you, guys. I'm going to sign off now. I have to prepare some exams for tomorrow.
Thank you very much. So I think with that, we will.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com. And the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.